Welcome to Chapter 8, Water Carriers and Pipelines. The previous weeks we've been studying the different modes of transportation: motor carriers, railroads, air and water freight. So today we're going to look at water carriers and pipelines and understand the following chapter objectives. We need to understand the importance of domestic waterways in the development of the economy of the U.S., particularly cities located contiguous to the waterways. Appreciate the role and significance of the water carrier industry at the present time in the U.S. economy. Discuss various types of water carriers and their role in the overall water carrier system. Understand the competitive environment for water carriers on the intramodal as well as the intermodal basis. Discuss service and operating characteristics of water carriers as well as their cost structure and equipment challenges. And understand the current issues faced by the water carrier industry in the 21st century. Appreciate the development and current position of the pipeline industry in the economy. And discuss the types of pipeline companies and their roles in the transportation system. Understand the nature of the operating service characteristics of pipeline carriers, what makes them unique, and discuss the cost structure and rates of pipelines. So these 10 objectives are very contiguous as to what you need to learn about this mode of transportation. Of course, it's not traditional in any way, but it is still carrying materials through a system. So let's talk about a little bit of overview of this. So water carriers and pipelines, they are overlooked by the general public. Most people are aware of the trucks and the planes and trains, but they have limited appreciation of the role and the contribution of the water and pipeline carriers to the business and, of course, to our economy. But these are two modes of transportation that's a very important part of our transportation system and our overall infrastructure. So especially when you're thinking about these certain types of products. In this chapter, we will look at the role, we will study the importance of water carriers and pipelines and how they are essential to a modern transportation system and help us gain some sort of understanding and appreciation of why they are so significant. So let's talk about a little bit about each facet of this mode. I think this is a very fascinating chapter because it's so different, but it is very, very central to what we've been studying with transportation and how it affects the supply chain. So we're going to talk about, first of all, just a brief history of transport, water transport. Inland and domestic waterways, like your rivers, your lakes, your oceans, they provide an important link for freight and people movement for centuries. In the waterways, they are a natural highway. Even some motive power, currents, and wind can be provided by nature. Water transportation has, of course, been improved by modern technology and federal investments to enhance motive power, vessel carrying capacity, and even the waterways by building dams and canals. And as of today, there's 26,000 navigable kilometers of waterways in the U.S. Pretty staggering, huh? The significance of water transport is that it's just one of the most viable modes of transportation for the movement of products, especially the basic raw materials. Domestic water carriers, they compete with railroads for the movement of bulk commodities like your grains, your coals, ores, and chemicals. In 2004, there was over $330 billion was spent on freight transportation, and that was 12% increase from the year 2000 levels. Intercity ton miles rose 5% during that same period, and expenditure of truck transportation dominated the market, whereas the water transportation market share, that excludes all international data, had a slight decline from 2.6 to 2.5% of freight expenditures from 2000 to 2004. But with water transportation, it's the second most efficient form of transportation in the terms of energy cost per dollars. But again, the most efficient form is rail with 6% of the energy output, while water transportation has 9, air travel has 21. But the water transportation energy costs, they rise more rapidly than other models. This is interesting to think about why they're so significant. There's also types of carriers. We got your private carriers. They can't be hired, only transports freight for the company that owns or leases the vessel. There's a for-hire water carriers. Those are regulated and exempt carriers that charge a fee for the services. And then these exempt carriers are excluded from the federal economic regulations administered by the Surface Transportation Board, the STB. Water carriers are exempt from economic regulation when transporting bulk commodities. But regulated water carriers are classified as either common or contract carriers. And domestic water carrier industry is mostly commonly classified by the waterway that's used, and carriers that operate over the inland navigable waterways are classified as internal water carriers. Coastal carriers, they operate along the coast serving the ports of the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans or the Gulf of Mexico. Intercoastal carriers, they transport freight between East Coast and West Coast ports through the Panama Canal. When we talk about the numbers and categories of carriers, there's a domestic for-hire water carrier industry has a limited number of small firms. And the latest numbers available from the Bureau of Transportation Stats is that from 2006, there were 682 vessel operators in service. That number has increased from 1,114 in the year 2000. There's also competition. There's a relatively small number of water carriers, but that results in a limited degree of competition. The number of carriers on a given waterway is limited, but there is a little incentive for water carriers to compete with one another by lowering rates because they realize the rate decrease must have to be matched. And when you think about the operating and service characteristics, we need to look at the commodities hauled and related characteristics. In 2007, water carriers hauled 164.8 million short tons of petroleum. That's 26.5% of the total short tons hauled that year. Chemicals was 8.2. Coal and coke represent about 29% of total freight moved by water carriers. Crude materials transported by water carriers are typically raw materials like forest products or pulp, metal ore, accounting for 17.6%. Agri products, they account for 15%. So water carriers can be considered as medium to long haul carriers, and barges can carry over 1,500 to 3,000 tons. The long haul's large carrying capacity combined with fuel efficiency allows water carriers to offer low-cost service of about 72 cents per ton mile on average. Water carriers are relatively slow, with average speeds on inland rivers with 5.5 to 9 miles per hour. We talk about the equipment, and there's types of vehicles. Because most of their domestic water carriers transport bulk materials, they use ships with very large holds, openings to facilitate easy loading. The largest ship in the domestic water carriage industry is the tanker, and a tanker can carry anywhere from 18,000 to 500,000 tons of liquid, like petroleum or petroleum products. And another type is a barge. It's a powerless vessel towed by a tugboat. Barges are most commonly used by internal waterway carriers, and additional barges can be added to a tow at very little additional cost. And the majority of fuel used by the water transportation is residual fuel oil. It's like your heavy fuel. It's a residue. And it's after crude oil is distilled. And diesel is also extracted from crude. It makes about the quarter of a fuel consumption in water transportation. There's also terminals, just like in airports. Water carrier terminals are often provided by the public. And over the past few decades, major port improvements have centered on the mechanization of materials handling systems, like your internal waterway ports, especially handling of larger volumes of bulk commodities. When we look at a cost structure, there are your fixed versus your variable cost components. The basic cost structure of water carriers is your relatively high variable cost and low fixed cost. The carrier pays user fees or user charges like lock fees, dock fees, fuel taxes for use of government-provided facilities. And these user charges are directly related to the volume of business. Operating costs for water carriers are approximately 85% variable and 15% fixed. When we think about the infrastructure too, the low fixed cost can be attributed to part of public aid in the area of infrastructure. Construction of locks and dams on rivers, they have made the waterways more navigable for the domestic water carriers. On one example of major public aid for domestic water carriers is the Tennessee Tenn-Tom project. And opened in 1985, that project connects Tennessee River and the Warrior River via the Tenn-Tom River. Another example of public aid was in 1986, the federal government built two 1,200-foot locks in a new dam at Lock and Dam number 26 on the Mississippi River system. When we look at labor, water transportation is not labor intensive. In 1997, there was 2.72 million tons of freight that was transported for each water carrier. And that's up to 4.74 million ton miles for each rail employee, 0.4 million ton miles for motor carrier, and 39.3 million ton miles for each pipeline employee. So as you think on the cost structure and the labor and infrastructure, it seems to be very low operational, but there is a lot that is involved in it. And it's also a very, very lucrative way to carry materials. But it is still not utilized as much as the other modes of transportation that we've discussed. When we also talk about the current issues, again, we study current issues, but just this mode of transportation, like all the others. Drug and alcohol abuse. The U.S. Coast Guard tests American seamen for drug abuse before they're issued by a seaman's license and before they can be employed. And the seamen are also tested randomly during their employment. We also talk about port development, another issue in current topics. Post-development or port development, those ports now have to balance competitive economic concerns with concerns of the public. Rightly or wrong, often view ports as a main source of air, water, and noise pollution. But the current issue that's facing North American ports is the growth of multi-carrier alliances leading to the expansion of already gargantuan ships. There's an increase from 6,000 20-foot equivalent units, TEU, to 8,000 TEUs, has many ports worried for the future. The larger the ships are, the deeper they go, meaning the many of the smaller ports will need to begin the dredging process as soon as possible to be able to complete in the future, and that's very expensive and labor intensive. When we talk about the global perspective, ports are an essential link, and they're critical. The forecasted growth in global trade is expected to bring even more pressure on U.S. ports, especially on the West Coast. And the U.S. port infrastructure makes the important connections between the maritime and trading system represented by the world fleet of the U.S. economy. And the U.S. consumers and producers, there's more than 300 ports in the U.S. right now. They vary greatly in ownership, size, and type of cargo and vessels that are handled. As we talked about water carriers, we're going to look at pipeline. The history of the pipeline, they played an important role in the transportation industry in post-World War II era. There's a decision rendered by the U.S. Supreme Court known as Champlain Oil case. Pipelines were required to operate as common carriers if they were demanded by shippers for oils of their services. And the pipeline industry is unique in a number of important aspects, including the type of commodity that's hauled. And pipelines are only mowed with no backhaul. They're unidirectional with products that only move in one direction through the line. So as we think about the significance of pipelines, they're accounted for over 20% of the total ton miles shipped in the U.S. in 2005. And there are types of carriers. There's common carriers, and there's also some private carriers, but the common carriers account for approximately 90% of all pipeline carriers. Oil companies are the ownership of these oil pipelines. In 2006, there was approximately 2,297 total pipeline operators. When we think about this is the oligopolistic nature of the industry is demonstrated by the fact that 20 major integrated oil companies control about 2/3 of the crude oil pipeline mileage. That is very interesting to reflect on. Oil carriers, the pipeline industry, experienced rapid growth after WW2, but the rate of growth has since decreased dramatically. But there's also natural gas carriers, and as we look at the operating and service characteristics, the commodities that are hauled, there's 4 main commodities: are the oil products, natural gas, coal, and chemicals. But there's a lot of relative advantages. There's a major advantages offered by the pipeline industry's low rates with average revenues. They're below 0.5% per ton mile. There's also 2 other advantages: that pipelines have a very good loss and damage record, and they can provide a warehousing function because their service is slow. Relative disadvantages, well, the slow speed is one disadvantage, as a pipeline will not be able to deliver an extra amount of the product. When you think about competition, it's divided intermodal and intermodal. Intermodal is limited of the small number of companies. The economies of scale is in high fixed costs preclude the facilities to a large extent. Pipelines compete with railroads, water carriers, and motor carriers, but the level of competition is limited. When we think about equipment, the U.S. Department of Transportation estimates total pipeline investment is in excess of $21 billion based on historical cost, and they can be grouped into other categories like gathering lines and trunk lines. But when you think about comparing the gathering lines and trunk lines, there's differences. They're smaller in diameter, but the trunk line is more or less often used in conjunction with oil movements, and they can refer to crude oil tank trunk lines or oil product lines. When we think about the commodity movement, gathering lines bring oil from the fields to the gathering station. Trunk lines are 30 inches in diameter, and they're the major component of the pipeline system. And when we think about the cost structure, again, it is fixed and variable cost components. And there's a high proportion of fixed costs with low capital turnover. The pricing rates is unique compared to the major modal competitors. And their pipeline rates are very low. They carry more than 15% of the total intercity ton miles. They receive about 2% in total revenues. And the one-way movement nature of operation provides little opportunity to provide differential pricing practices. Pipeline's quote rate on a per well basis is 1 barrel equals 42 gallons. So this is a very eye-opening chapter. And I hope that you will study and have a greater appreciation for the water carriers and pipelines to the supply chain.